Thanks, Rod. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Great to see you all. Thanks so much for coming along on a day of pretty crazy, or week of pretty crazy weather. I want to say a huge thank you to Ashley, of course, and the whole team in Auckland Council who have done a real power of work. Okay, that's stopped. A real power of work pulling together today's event, and particularly to Gareth, my colleague, who's the incredible lead of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance hub here in New Zealand. I encourage you all to get involved. They're doing phenomenal work, putting out ideas, spotlighting incredible pioneers, and they've got a great sounding conference coming up in a few months, which you'll hear about just at the very end. I'm going to apologise because I can't see my slides, so every now and again I'm going to keep turning around. So apologies for the moments I have my back to you. But yeah, really great to be here. And Rod, you were saying I've been learning a bit about New Zealand. I came over with the book in my hand luggage from one of Australia's brilliant quarterly essays written by one of Australia's best political journalists, Laura Tingle, and it's entitled The High Road, What Australia Can Learn from New Zealand. And I've shown this to a couple of people, including a few members of Parliament yesterday, and more than one person has said, yeah, but is that a fake cover? Which is either a beautiful sign of humility, or it's actually how you really think Australia sees New Zealand, that we wouldn't really think we can learn anything. But I really mean it genuinely. There's a lot going on here that the world has sat up and taken notice of. And I know that you're close to it, so you look under the bonnet and you think, oh, we're not doing enough yet. And there's a good phrase from a brilliant sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, and he says, a good society is one that knows it's not yet good enough. And I think that really describes New Zealand at the moment. You know there's a lot more to do, but I want to really recognise the beginning steps that are being taken here. So I'm going to talk to you about the wellbeing economy idea and really what it's in response to, and Rod's already talked about the environmental breakdown, and this is from the latest IPCC last year where the Antonio Guterres was saying we are in code red, and of course the sixth report came out a few months ago where he was saying we are in last chance saloon. And of course climate change is only one element of the environmental breakdown that we're seeing, and I certainly don't need to tell people from Auckland how this plays out in your everyday life, how disruptive we're already seeing the impact of climate change. So this is happening on the environmental front. We have an economic system that is putting huge pressure. But it's also not taking care of enough people. And I was hearing about the huge economic inequalities in New Zealand, how wealth has gone to those at the very top. Most heartbreakingly, I've been hearing that 7% of young people before they hit their teenage years have spent time as homeless, which is heartbreaking. I was hearing about the incredible increasing list for social housing, and you start to get a picture of an economic system that is not working for people, and it's putting huge pressure on the planet. And what happens is that then you have government policies and government initiatives spending money to try to attend to some of the damage that economic system does. So I want to share with you these two concepts, this idea of failure demand and the avoidable costs. Failure demand is a concept that comes from management literature, an author called John Seddon. And in Scotland, they took this idea that more demand for something isn't necessarily a good thing. So if you've got a company and you're getting loads and loads of calls to your call centre, this is John Seddon's example, he said, not necessarily a good thing if they're all complaints. And so in Scotland, there was a huge report just over 10 years ago into the future of public services in Scotland called the Christie Review. And they estimated that just for local government, about 40%, this is a very conservative estimate, about 40% of what local governments were spending money on was due to the impacts of inequality and poverty and environmental breakdown. This is what ecological economists would describe as defensive expenditures. So you only need to look at, here you see this idea of guard labour. It's a term that was coined by Harvard economists about 10 years ago, and they estimated that in the US, about 5 million people were employed in guard labour, essentially jobs created because we're scared of each other. Security guards, installing these sorts of systems, working in defence industries. An update on that figure is that they now estimate that in many cities in the US, there are more people working in guard labour than there are teachers in the cities. which I think is a dire indictment of our priorities. But also in Australia, it's been estimated that by 2050, $35 billion will be spent responding to impacts of extreme weather events. Even just today, it's been estimated that almost $3 billion is the cost to the Australian economy of loneliness. The UK estimates that the costs of attending to poverty, the cost of responding to poverty, is well over £80 billion. And I suspect there'll be a lot of examples here in New Zealand where you can, and once you start reading political announcements, listen to the budget in a week's time, a lot of the things that will be heralded as we're spending this much money here or investing money here, a lot of it, if you take a second look, is responding after the fact to the fact that we haven't created an economy that gets things right for people and planet first time around. So there's a huge fiscal price tag to the way we're running our system. It's incredibly inefficient, even in its own terms. And these words, I think, are incredibly apt for today, that the economic system in which we find ourselves is not intelligent, and I think the fact, the extent of failure, demand, and avoidable costs is a good example of that. It's not beautiful. We'll look at the damage we're doing to our precious planet. It's not just, all the inequalities, vertical and horizontal inequalities. It's not virtuous and does not deliver the goods. And this person went on, in short, we're beginning to dislike it and despise it. And I think we see examples of that, of people reaching for populist political solutions or just completely checking out, turning to drugs, alcohol, or cocooning themselves, focusing inward on perfecting their home or drinking as many green drinks and doing as much yoga as they can, but not engaging with the rest of society. And then this person went on and said, when we wonder what to put in its place, we're extremely perplexed. Now, this was John Maynard Keynes writing 90 years ago. And I think now, some 90 years on, we have a lot of ideas of what to put in its place. And so this is where the wellbeing economy idea comes in. And the wellbeing economy is an inclusive term. There's lots of different beautiful schools of thought, lots of different people painting the brushstrokes of what a different economic system looks like. And I often think about the wellbeing economy as a bit like a picnic blanket underneath those different schools of thought. And they all have their different emphasis, their different terminology. But essentially, at their core, they're saying we need an economy that operates in service of people and planet. It's about delivering an economy that delivers social justice on a healthy planet. And I think that's a pretty awesome goal for our economic system. So how do we go about building that sort of economic system? And you've probably already been thinking, well, it's a big task, Katherine. There's a lot of changes that we need, and you're absolutely right. And I tend to think of it like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. There's lots of different shifts that are required, from our local communities right up to our supranational institutions, from tax systems to business models to transport systems to energy systems to how we produce and consume. So a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. But what do you do when you're starting to embark on a jigsaw puzzle? You always start with the corners, don't you? So to at least help get my head around that plethora of shifts that are needed for a wellbeing economy, I think about the 4 Ps of putting the wellbeing economy into practice. So these are purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people-powered. So I'll talk to you about those just briefly, and then we'll get into some examples so you can get a feel for what it looks like. So the first one, purpose. Essentially, this is about thinking, what is the goal of the economy? Not necessarily a goal in its own right, but to deliver what people and planet need. And so when it comes to growing the economy, we need to be fair weather friends of economic growth, rather than it's just its ever faithful followers, rather than just assuming that if we grow the economy, that will be an automatic read across to solving all our problems, because we know that that hasn't worked in the past, and we know now that's putting huge pressure on the planet. So this is about understanding the difference between means and ends. Is growth a goal in its own right, or are we going to see it as in service of those goals that we're really after, our ultimate goals? And so that takes us to quite a different conversation about economic growth. Not so much about the rate, but about the composition and the direction of that growth. At the micro level as well, pro-social business models are saying, yes, we need to make a profit to keep going, to be financially viable, but we're doing so to contribute to social and environmental goals. I also think this idea of purpose really matters when it comes to when we think about what sort of activities in our societies and our economies are most contributing to the public good. And I think during COVID, it caused us to pause and take a good hard look at what are really essential services, what are essential workers, whose work is it that makes the most positive difference to our lives. So the sort of things you'd see in this corner of the jigsaw puzzle are multi-dimensional wellbeing frameworks. New Zealand's Living Standards Framework would be an example of that. Scotland has something called the National Performance Framework. In fact, over half of the OECD countries have multi-dimensional wellbeing frameworks. And as I said, pro-social business models are another great example, and I'll give you a few specific examples of those in a moment. The next corner is around, rather than just focusing on crisis by crisis, responding to symptom by symptom, spending all that money on failure demand, tending to those avoidable costs, this corner of the jigsaw puzzle is about saying, let's take the time to look upstream. I'm often saying to folk, we need to channel our inner 3-year-olds. So if any of you have got kids who are sort of 3 years old, or nieces or nephews or grandchildren, you know, they go through that stage where they're a little bit annoying and they're always saying, but why? Why? We need to be like that. We need to ask, why are there more homeless people sleeping rough in our doorways? Why are young people scared for their future? Why is there an epidemic in the UK, and I suspect it's probably similar here, of self-harm? Why are people sleeping in tents across Australia because they can no longer afford their rent? And take the time to look upstream at the root causes and start to take action there. So the more jobs we have that pay people enough to live on, the less top-up payments we'll need to undertake through our welfare systems. In the UK, a huge percentage of the UK welfare budget is paying people who are already in work through in-work tax credits because of the extent of poverty wages. The more fulfilling and full of control and autonomy people's jobs are, the less anti-anxiety treatments our GPs will be prescribing. The more circular our economic systems, the fewer beach and river cleanups we'll have to do on the weekends. The more renewable our energy systems, the less carbon capture, sequestration and storage we'll be having to spend money on. So you get the point. This is about daring to ask upstream. I want to quickly say though, this is not about denigrating that downstream response, because acute needs are very real right now. So we need to help people and planet survive and cope today and tomorrow. But the wellbeing economy agenda is an invitation to say yes and. Let's raise our gaze upstream and try to help things go right first time around. So the next one, pre-distribution. This is about saying we can do better than just let the gap between rich and poor open up so much in the first place, and then at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, turning to government and say, right, government, through your taxes, and we know how fraught levying taxes is. You've probably heard about the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers, the extent of tax evasion and avoidance. And then to use those taxes to then channel that money back through welfare payments, and we know how horribly stigmatising some of those debates can be. So all the political machinations that with that redistribution project, pre-distribution is about saying, yes, that's important, but let's get the economy to do much more of the heavy lifting. Let's design our market outcomes so that they deliver more equality from the beginning, so the government doesn't need to do such a heavy lift. In Australia, the government reduces the gap between rich and poor by about 1/3, which feels like a big, heavy lift for me. So pre-distribution is saying, okay, let's get the economy involved here. So things that you'd see in this corner of the jigsaw puzzle are things like worker-owned cooperatives, where you have labour owning the capital. The community wealth building agenda, where you have, let's say, instead of waiting for trickle-down economics, let's build the economies from the community up through things like local ownership, local procurement, local employment. Also things like true cost accounting, where you say, what's the true cost of something like this, or our phones? So we see that the price signals are actually taking account of the environmental and social cost. And then the final one is people-powered. This is how we make sure that people are at the very apex of economic decision making, so that they don't feel that they're at the beck and flow of decisions taken in boardrooms or corridors of government elsewhere. So the sort of things you'd see in this corner are things like participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies, more economic democracy, so maybe workers on boards, or again, worker-owned cooperatives. So they're the sorts of things that we need to see more of to build a wellbeing economy. And the good news is that there are various people around the world working on various pieces of that jigsaw puzzle, building it, experimenting, figuring out how to do this. So of course government has an important role here though, and I want to reflect very, very briefly on how government needs to step in. And I want to just share with you this sequence. So if our ultimate goal is social justice on a healthy planet, or thriving people, or sustainable well-being, or however you want to describe it, that has to then be underpinned by a wellbeing economy. So the wellbeing economy is not the ultimate goal. It's how it is in service of the goal of delivering social justice on a healthy planet. And so the government has a role by really thinking about how can it use all the policy instruments and tools at its hand to shape the policy context, to encourage the sort of activities that we need more of in our economy, and then to power down those that, if we're really honest with ourselves, we need to power down in a just way because they're not aligned with what people and the planet need. And so that means then reshaping what are the goals and processes of government. So let me give you some examples with just one footnote. Some of the best examples, and probably 99% of the examples, will not have the word well-being in them, in the title of the policy or in the preamble of the legislation or even how people talk about it. The key test is, how do they start to reshape the economic system? How do they start to address inequalities of power and wealth? How do they treat the planet? So I've just spent almost the last 2 decades living in Scotland, so I'm going to take you to Scotland briefly for a couple of examples. Oh, let me go back, too fast. Okay, underneath that first image. You can see there a bit of a flower shape. This is something called the National Performance Framework, where Scotland doesn't have a constitution. So in a way, in lieu of that, the National Performance Framework is potentially one of the most important documents in the Scottish Government. It sets out what the goal of government is, what the purpose of the economy is. And the current iteration, at its very, very heart, which you can see if I hadn't clicked too quickly, has things like people growing up. Oh, thank you. Has people growing up with kindness, kids growing up loved, reducing poverty and inequality through reducing imbalances of power and wealth, diverse cultures being respected and cherished, understanding our planetary boundaries. And so what they're doing now is thinking, how do we align those goals with our budget making? And how do we test all the policies that government ministers are proposing against these, what they call purpose targets? And they're currently reviewing this, and it's going through a process of community consultation. It's now in legislation. They have to do that every 5 years or so. And so the next one is a brilliant agency. They have a dedicated government agency called Zero Waste Scotland that is charged with making the Scottish economy more circular, rather than just linear, take, make, waste and throw out. So really keeping our planet's precious resources in circulation much longer. So they're doing that through sharing innovation and knowledge and really encouraging and supporting businesses to be more circular. Scottish Enterprise, which is the big enterprise agency in Scotland, has a key mission to support more pro-social business models, whether that's supporting social enterprises, whether that's supporting worker cooperatives or B Corps. So they're training their frontline staff, their business advisors, to not just put one model on the table where someone comes to them and says, I want to start a business. They're saying, have you considered social enterprise? This is what it looks like. Have you considered a worker co-op? Here's what this might look like. And here's how we can help you go through that process. So using those levers of business advice, funding support, procurement support to encourage these sorts of business models to eventually start to make up more of the ecosystem in Scotland. They've also just had a big process of a Just Transition Commission that's now moving to implementation stage, where they've been speaking to people like oil workers on the North Sea, other workers in industries that are needing to be powered down, but they want to do so in a just way, help people feel in control of that process, and most importantly, take care of people's livelihoods. Because we know when people's livelihoods, when they feel their livelihoods are threatened, they will hold on to what they know, quite understandably. So there's a collective responsibility to take care of people during that process of transition. I want to give you another few examples, and I could go on with probably hundreds other examples. These are just a couple that I've pulled out for this trip. If I was here in a month, I'd probably share with you another few different ones. There's so many good examples around the world. This one is Sophie Howe, who's just stepped down as her role as Future Generations Commissioner in Wales. And her job has been, and that of her successor, a guy called Darren Walker, is to scrutinise the work of the 56 Welsh public agencies and the budgets and policy making in Wales to say, how does this align with the goals and the objectives in the Welsh Wellbeing of Current and Future Generations Act? And to work with what she calls policy frustrated champions within government departments to help to push that agenda. She runs that ruler over policy proposals and will call out when she feels they've got it wrong. She's going to be in New Zealand in July, so make sure you get along to see her. She's incredible. And it's I've heard a lot of people complaining since I've been here this week of the 3-year political cycle. It's initiatives like this, having a dedicated officer for future generations. It's a bit of an antidote to short-term political thinking. The next one is somewhere like Sweden that's saying we want to encourage a more circular economy. We want to encourage repair and reuse rather than just throwing away your toaster as soon as it breaks or your jeans as soon as they've got a little hole in them. And so they've said, okay, let's reduce the VAT from 25% down to 12%. It's a brilliant example. These sorts of simple things where you can use the levers that government have at their disposal to encourage certain activities that we need more of. In France, they've said if you can get somewhere by train in 2.5 hours, you're not allowed to take a flight. It's incredibly significant because they're saying get on the train. And you know European trains are great, and I know you have been working on it. Maybe not so good here yet, but these are the. That's a sore point, isn't it? But you know how good European trains are. So this is pretty reasonable, isn't it? Saying, if you can get there 2.5 hours, no short haul flights anymore. These are the sorts of initiatives that we need to see more of. In Italy, over many years, and even in their constitution, they have been proactively encouraging worker-owned cooperatives. And so this law is one that really supports building an ecosystem of cooperatives. When a firm is likely to go into administration, this law is really proactive in supporting those workers buy out, take ownership of that firm. In northern Italy, there's a beautiful region called Emilia-Romagna. Bologna is the capital. Beautiful place. If you haven't been there and you're next in Europe, go. Its tagline is the fat, the red and the learned, because they're amazing food, because of their politics and because they've got one of the oldest universities in the world. But 1/3 of Bologna's GDP, I'm going to come back to this, 1/3 of Bologna's GDP is made up of is from co-ops. So these sorts of initiatives to really encourage more worker-owned co-ops. And then in places like Israel, but also in Oregon in the US, you have legislators saying we don't want these huge inequalities of pay anymore. So if you top out over a certain level of the ratio of the CEO to the median or the lowest paid earner, we're going to pile on the taxes because we don't think you need to earn quite so much. In Oregon, they're directing the funds from that tax directly to homeless services, so a bit of hypothecation. I want to share with you some enterprises because I think this agenda is absolutely about bringing out the best of business, and there are plenty of examples of enterprises around the world and here in New Zealand that are saying we can be part of the solution. We can be part of contributing to social justice on a healthy planet by being commercially viable, but doing so through particular reasons. So let me show you a few examples. So the Wellbeing Economy Alliance a few years ago published their Wellbeing of Business Guide, and they said there are 7 dimensions that they'd encourage enterprises to look at in thinking about how can they be much more part of the solution. So things like, what's the definition of success? Is it short-term profit, or is it actually to contribute purpose and contribute to addressing society's challenges, or even worse, is it making money from society's challenges? Who governs and owns the firm? Is it held very narrowly, or is it broadly spread? Are stakeholders or employees or local communities part of that? How is leadership and participation structured? Who is around the boardroom table when decisions are made? How are the stakeholder and relationships divvied up? Who is defined as the community of the business? What's the purpose of product and service innovation? What is it that they're trying to come out? Are these innovations that are for society, to contribute to society, or are they just perniciously making money from society's problems? And we could certainly discuss examples of that over a wine afterwards. How do they account for impact and return on investment? And is there a spirit of learning together and experimenting and being innovative, but learning from that in a positive, constructive way? So let me share with you a couple of my favourite examples. I suspect you might have some examples too of businesses that you're familiar with. I'd love to hear about them because I find these enterprises incredibly inspiring. So again, let me take you back to Scotland, and then I'll go global. This is a brilliant network in Glasgow and beyond of repair shops, and their tagline is, if it's broken, fix it. And so you can take along your toaster or your jeans. I took my old laptop when the battery had run out, and they fix it for you. So you don't need to throw it away. They repair things, so you can keep them in circulation longer. So they're an antidote to planned obsolescence. This is one of my favourite ones, craft brewing company. This guy wakes up every morning thinking, how can he make his business more sustainable? He captures the CO2 from making his beer. His tap room that you can see there is all made from old pallets that he got from construction sites. He uses prawn shells instead of plastic, a sort of substance made from prawn shells, to link his cans of beer together instead of those plastic rings. And he's got a line of beer called Hardtack that is all made from bread that would have been thrown away from a nearby bakery. He's absolutely brilliant. If you're in Glasgow, go and meet him. There's a brilliant worker cooperative in Glasgow called Green City Whole Foods. They've been around since the 70s, so they're doing something right. And their workers own the firm. They're trying to localise their supply chains and think of ways to be more sustainable, more circular, and through wholesale foods of healthy food, be part of positive direction of travel in Glasgow's infamously unhealthy diet. And in Sydney, there's this restaurant. I was telling Gareth that I haven't yet visited it, but I'm going in a fortnight, so I'll report back. This is a restaurant called Re. Everything you touch, they say on their website, would have been thrown away. So the cups, the bar table is plastic that would have been thrown away. They make their food and their beautiful looking cocktails from food that other restaurants would have thrown away. So I'll go and check it out. I'll report back to you. And again, if you're in Sydney, go and see it. But it's more than just these relatively small and quite sweet examples. So huge bank from the Netherlands, but now in other countries around Europe. My UK account is with these guys, Triodos Bank. They're a registered B Corp, and they see their job as channeling credit to the sort of activities that we need more of in a wellbeing economy. They have an asset lock as well, so no single investor can dominate their decision making. There's an Edinburgh-based company called Faith in Nature, and they have said, we will have someone, and they've appointed this woman already, they've had someone on their board, so sitting around all board decision making, whose job it is to represent the interests of nature. I think it's incredible. And then you have massive companies like Microsoft pledging to go not just net zero, but carbon negative. So take out all the carbon that it has emitted in its operations since its day of foundation in 1975. We'll have to watch how they go, but these sorts of pledges and these sorts of intentions are important. And similarly, for a massive company like Unilever, who makes your toothpaste and your peanut butter and all sorts of things, they've said we want to be a complete living wage company. So we will not procure or have anyone in our supply chain who's not paying the living wage. These are the sort of examples of companies and businesses that prove the possible. Oh, the final one. This is the idea of this Scandinavian idea of foundation companies. These are big companies that are owned by a foundation, or at least majority shares owned by a foundation. So they have much longer term patient capital. And what happens is the profits and the benefits go to this foundation to then invest in philanthropic activities. So the example here, Novo Nordisk, one of the biggest companies by capitalisation in Scandinavia, its job is to rid the world of diabetes. That's its mission. And so let's come back to cities, because Auckland's hosting me here. What is it that cities can do to be part of this? So I think there are three really, really key questions that cities need to be asking themselves. First of all, what is it that citizens and ecosystems here, but also beyond the city realm, really need? And do that through consultation and deliberation and vision setting. What is our vision for the sort of city we want to be now and into the future? Next then is think about, okay, what sort of economic activity needs to underpin that? What sort of economic ecosystem do we need to deliver that vision? And then finally, take a good hard look at all the economic levers. And we're talking today about planning and procurement, all those, or licensing, all those economic levers. Yes, cities don't have everything under their control, but there's plenty they can do to start to encourage and cajole and celebrate and incentivize different sort of economic activities in their neighbourhoods and high streets. So, I love this. It's essentially about getting away from groupthink and being inspired to think bolder, bigger questions, not just replicating what's been done before, not just reaching for 20th century recipes, but saying we're in a particularly unique period of time. We've got enormous environmental breakdown, we've got huge inequalities, but we have a chance, an opportunity. There's incredible wisdom around the world, there's excited, animated innovators, there's activists, there's incredible people in our cities. How can we channel that to ask big, bold questions and stride ahead and create cities that are fit for the 21st century? So there's models that you can use, whether it's this from Thriving Places that are saying, here's how we might start to define success in our city through equality, local conditions and sustainability, or it's the work of the Donut Economic Action Lab that has what they call the 4 lenses to start to think about how do we reorientate our cities and our neighbourhoods in line with living below planetary boundaries, but lifting everyone above a social foundation. And I think the real key thing is not going back to lowest common denominator, but learning from and being inspired by the pioneers. So I'm going to give you a few examples of those from cities that I see around the world who I think are doing amazing work. And so I mentioned earlier community wealth building. This is Preston and a document from North Ayrshire in the south of Scotland. These cities, along with Cleveland in Ohio, are saying, how do we build that economic energy from the community up? So how do we make sure that anchor organisations like hospitals or schools or even local council who are going to need catering, who are going to need cleaning services, how can they make sure they don't contract them out to the next multinational company like Serco or Afery? Don't tweet that, but I'll get sued. But you know what I mean. How do they procure that from local businesses, local ownership? How do they maybe bring smaller businesses together so that they can tackle those bigger contracts? Preston has been recognised by, I think, the Good Cities Index as one of the most resilient cities through the global financial crisis and through COVID. So something's working. The Lancet has just reported on mental health in Preston and shown that it's been rising over the last few decades. So it's starting to work in Scotland. They've got a minister for community wealth building, and he's taking through Parliament a community wealth building bill at the moment. This is a town in Germany, Freiburg, where they've got this mission to be 100% renewable. You see they're starting to convert a lot of businesses. They're giving incentives, including financial incentives, to their citizens to compost, to recycle, even to use fabric nappies for their kids. And what they do is you get financial incentives, but also you get footy tickets, which I think is a great idea. They're encouraging renewable energy businesses and other sorts of sustainable businesses to come into their city. So people now working for them make up a huge percentage of the workforce. Again, it's a city that's got this vision and saying we're going to look at all the levers we can to get towards that vision. The Sharing Cities Alliance is a great example. And you see Amsterdam at the top there that's been named Europe's best sharing city. They have a network of ambassadors, building an ecosystem around sharing economies, whether that's car clubs or tool libraries and so on. Seoul has something called the Sharing and Participation Committee, which sounds a little bit scary and top-down and bureaucratic, but they are giving over public building spaces to encourage sharing. They're removing obstructive bylaws that are perhaps hindering the sharing and collaborative economy. They're saying, how can we go further, encouraging people to share their assets, whether that's cars or tools or toys, and keep things circulating and really move from ownership to access. So people don't need to own everything anymore. They can all share things a little bit better. So these are examples of cities that are rolling up their sleeves and having a go at that. This is Bologna that I was talking about earlier, where a third of their GDP is generated by cooperatives. They've got high level of female wages, so the gender inequality gap in terms of earnings is relatively low compared to other cities. Lot in the care sector, in the manufacturing sector, and of course you've probably all heard of Mondragon in the Basque region of Spain, one of the biggest worker co-ops in the world. And then co-housing, this is the biggest co-housing in London. They share library, they've got their own pub, They come together. So again, you don't have to everyone have a washing machine of your own, or a tool of your own, or a vacuum cleaner of your own. You can start to share those goods that you don't need access to every single day. This is one of my favourite examples. This is the borough of Lambeth in London. And this is a really great example of asset-based development. What they figured out is that the land that they have most control over is curbs, which I think's just gorgeous. They've said, okay, we've got curbs in our city, so how can we make the most of that curb space to bring about the sort of activities that we need more of? So they've said, we're going to convert a quarter at least of our curb space to things like bike hangars, car clubs, electric vehicle charging, seating just for people to sit and be and chat to each other, not have to spend money to get your latte at Starbucks to get a seat, but you can just sit and be. They're also building what they call parklets, which is really cute. I think tiny, tiny little parks and green spaces. They've got a whole strategy now, a curbside strategy. It's worth looking at, incredibly inspiring. These are the sorts of examples that cities could fairly readily do if they decide this sort of agenda is a priority, to design their localities and their spaces and their economic activity in a way that's in line with what people and planet and their citizens need. So the next one, the final point, is around collaboration. And cities are really good at that. You've got the C40 network, you've got mayors for inclusive growth and so on. It's about really understanding what have others tried, what worked, what didn't, what can we pick up on, what can we learn from each other. And I want to just share this example, not least because one of the members of the We All Alliance governing body, Susie Morrissey, is there at the front, just nicely hanging out with Joseph Stiglitz, as one does. This was the launch of WeGo, the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. This is in Seoul, the OECD's Wellbeing Forum in 2018. And New Zealand was there with Scotland and Iceland, launching this partnership, the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, that was saying, we get this in the 21st century. Development cannot just be about narrow focused on economic growth measured by GDP. We want to figure out how to put collective well-being at the heart of our economic policy making, but none of us have all the answers. So we want to learn from each other and go on a journey of continuous improvement together. So they meet through policy labs, they discuss, they share, they get in expert speakers to, as I said, go through this journey of continuous improvement. And since that photo was taken during the COVID times, Wales joined, Finland joined, and for all intents and purposes, Canada is part of WeGo. I want to finish with this slide because it's a bit of a techie slide, but I think it's absolutely, to me, an inspiring message. This is from Jules Peck at the Real Economy Lab, and what they've done is they've mapped out the different roles and functions that we need in a wellbeing economy movement, in the economic system change movement. And the message I take from this is that there is a role for everyone, no matter what your skill is, no matter where your energy levels are, no matter what you're angry about, no matter what you're excited about bringing to the party. There is a role for every different sort of contribution, whether you're a historian, a connector, a facilitator, a disruptor, an innovator, a practitioner. We need all of that. And so the key thing is, yes, this is a fundamental change to our economic systems. Yes, this is going to take some time. It's not a simple flick of the light switch. We need to transform how governments operate. We need to repurpose our economies. We need to change all those different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. But the good news is there is lots of different people from around the world and here in New Zealand who are starting to put those jigsaw puzzles in place and bringing all those different contributions to bear on undertaking economic system change. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for coming along tonight.